In the heart of ancient Persia, where the sun scorched the earth and the winds carried whispers of forgotten gods, a warrior named Ariaramnes carved his name into the annals of a turbulent age. The year was 522 BCE, a time when the Achaemenid Empire, vast and sprawling, teetered on the edge of chaos. Darius, newly crowned, sat uneasily on the throne, his claim challenged by rebels and usurpers who sought to tear the empire apart. It was in this crucible of blood and ambition that Ariaramnes, a man of unyielding will, emerged from the shadows of history, not as a king, but as a defender of Persia's soul. Born in the rugged highlands of Persis, Ariaramnes was no noble draped in silk. His hands were calloused from wielding a spear, his face etched with scars from battles fought in the name of loyalty. He was a commander of the immortals, the elite warriors whose very names struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. Yet, unlike the polished generals of Persepolis, Ariaramnes was a man of the people, his heart tethered to the dusty villages and the men who toiled under the empire's weight. His legend began not with grand proclamations but with a single, brutal act that would echo through the ages. The empire was fracturing. In the east, the satrap of Bactria, a man named Vahyasdata, had declared himself king, claiming descent from Cyrus the Great. His rebellion spread like wildfire, drawing warriors from the steppes and mountains, each one hungry for glory or vengeance. Darius, still consolidating his power, sent emissaries to quell the uprising, but they returned in pieces, heads staked outside villages as a warning. The message was clear: Persia would bleed. It was then that Ariaramnes, stationed in the fortified city of Ecbatana, received the king's desperate summons. The order was simple but heavy: crush the rebellion or watch the empire fall. Ariaramnes gathered his men under the starlit sky, their bronze armor glinting faintly in the torchlight. He spoke no words of glory or promises of reward. Instead, his voice, rough as the cliffs of his homeland, carried a grim truth. We fight not for gold, but for the earth that bore us. If Persia falls, our children's children will know only chains. His warriors, a mix of grizzled veterans and young men eager to prove themselves, nodded in silence. They knew the cost of failure. The march to Bactria began at dawn, a column of 10,000 men snaking through the Zagros mountains, their footsteps a drumbeat of defiance. The journey was merciless. Sandstorms blinded them, and the narrow passes left no room for error. One misstep meant a plunge into rocky chasms. Supplies dwindled, and the men chewed on dried dates and sipped from half-empty waterskins. Ariaramnes led from the front, his broad shoulders cutting through the wind, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was no stranger to hardship. His father, a shepherd-turned-soldier, had died defending a village from Scythian raiders. That loss had forged Ariaramnes into a man who valued survival over sentiment, action over words. Yet, even he could not ignore the whispers among his men, tales of Vahyasdata's sorcery, of demons summoned to guard his stronghold. After weeks of grueling travel, they reached the plains of Bactria, where the rebel army awaited. Vahyasdata's forces numbered nearly 20,000, a motley horde of archers, spearmen, and cavalry drawn from the fringes of the empire. They had fortified a narrow valley, its cliffs lined with archers ready to rain death on any who approached. Ariaramnes surveyed the terrain, his mind a map of blood and stone. He knew a frontal assault would be suicide, but retreat was not in his nature. Instead, he devised a plan as cunning as it was brutal. Under the cover of night, Ariaramnes split his forces. A small contingent, led by his trusted lieutenant Hystaspes, would feign a frontal attack, drawing the enemy's attention. Meanwhile, Ariaramnes took 2,000 of his best men, scaling the cliffs under moonlight, their hands bleeding from jagged rocks. The ascent was a gamble. One loose stone could betray them, one cry could spell doom. But Ariaramnes moved with the precision of a panther, his men following in silent awe. By dawn, they had reached the cliff tops, overlooking the rebel encampment like vultures circling a dying beast. The signal was a single arrow, flaming against the gray sky. Hystaspes' men charged, their war cries echoing through the valley. Vahyasdata's forces took the bait, rushing to meet the assault. It was then that Ariaramnes struck. His men descended like a storm, their spears tearing through the archers on the cliffs. Blood sprayed across the rocks as the rebels, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. Ariaramnes fought at the forefront, his Achaemenid, a short, wickedly sharp sword, slicing through armor and flesh. A rebel captain lunged at him, only to meet Ariaramnes' shield, which shattered the man's jaw. The warrior's eyes burned with a fire that unnerved even his own men, as if he were possessed by the spirit of Ahura Mazda himself. The battle raged for hours, the valley a cauldron of screams and clashing steel. By midday, the cliffs were slick with blood, and the rebel archers were no more. Ariaramnes' gambit had turned the tide, but the cost was heavy. Hundreds of his men lay dead, their bodies tangled among the rocks. Yet the warrior pressed on, rallying his forces to join Hystasps in the valley below. Together, they carved through the rebel ranks, their unity a stark contrast to the chaos of Vahyasdata's army. By nightfall, the rebellion was broken, its survivors fleeing into the desert, pursued by Ariaramnes' cavalry. But victory was not the end of Ariaramnes' tale. As his men tended to their wounds and buried their dead, a messenger arrived from Persepolis. Darius' spies had uncovered a new threat, a conspiracy within the capital itself. Nobles, envious of the king's rise, were plotting to betray him, and they had allies in Bactria. The messenger carried a sealed scroll, its contents known only to Ariaramnes. His face darkened as he read it, and without a word, he burned the parchment in the fire. His men watched, uneasy, as their commander's gaze turned westward, toward the heart of the empire. The warrior who had saved Persia from one enemy now faced another, one that would test not just his strength, but his very soul. Ariaramnes stood among the carnage of the Bactrian valley, his armor stained with the blood of foes and friends alike. The rebellion was crushed, but the weight of the scroll's words lingered like a shadow. The empire he had fought for was rotting from within, its nobles scheming in the gilded halls of Persepolis while men like him bled on distant battlefields. He knew the road back would be no less perilous than the one that had brought him here. The conspiracy in the capital was not a mere whisper, it was a blade poised at Darius' throat, and Ariaramnes was now tasked with stopping it. He rallied his men at dawn, their numbers diminished but their resolve unbroken. The march back to Persepolis was a race against time. The Zagros Mountains, which had tested them before, now seemed to mock their exhaustion. Ariaramnes drove them hard, allowing no rest beyond the barest hours needed to keep them alive. He himself slept little, haunted by the names listed in the scroll, men he had fought beside, men he had called brothers. Betrayal was a wound deeper than any spear, and it festered in his heart as they pressed onward. The empire's roads, once a marvel of Achaemenid engineering, were now plagued by bandits and deserters. In one ambush, a band of Scythian raiders struck a supply caravan meant for Ariaramnes' army. The warrior led a counterattack, his cavalry thundering through the dust to meet the enemy. The clash was swift and brutal. Scythian axes met Persian shields, and the ground was churned to mud with blood. Ariaramnes fought like a man possessed, his spear piercing a raider's chest before the man could draw his bow. The raiders fled, but not before claiming a dozen of his men. Each loss was a reminder of the cost of loyalty, yet Ariaramnes showed no hesitation, his focus unshakable. As they neared Persepolis, the air grew thick with tension. Spies reported that the conspirators, led by a noble named Phordes, had gained influence in the royal court. Phordes was no warrior, but his wealth and cunning made him dangerous. He had promised land and titles to any who would join him, and whispers of his plot had spread even to the common folk. Ariaramnes, ever wary, sent scouts ahead to infiltrate the city. They returned with grim news. Phordes had bribed a faction of the Immortals, turning brothers in arms against their own. The betrayal stung, but Ariaramnes saw it not as defeat, but as a challenge. He devised a plan to enter Persepolis undetected. Disguising his men as merchants and laborers, he split them into small groups, each slipping through the city's gates under the guise of trade caravans. Ariaramnes himself donned a tattered cloak, his face obscured by a hood, his Achaemenid hidden beneath. The city was alive with tension, its markets buzzing with rumors of rebellion and war. Guards loyal to Phordes patrolled the streets, their eyes sharp for any sign of Darius' men. Ariaramnes moved like a ghost, his steps silent, his mind racing with the weight of his mission. At the heart of Persepolis stood the grand palace, its columns towering like sentinels. Here, Phordes held court, surrounded by his loyalists. Ariaramnes' scouts had learned of a secret meeting planned at midnight, where the conspirators would finalize their plot to seize the throne. The warrior knew this was his chance. He gathered his most trusted men, 50 in all, and led them through the city's labyrinthine alleys to a hidden passage beneath the palace. The tunnel, carved centuries ago, was known only to a few, its entrance guarded by traps that could crush a man in an instant. The descent was treacherous. Torchlight flickered against damp stone, revealing ancient carvings of forgotten kings. One false step triggered a mechanism, sending a boulder crashing inches from Ariaramnes' head. His men froze, but he pressed on, his voice a low growl. "Fear is for the dead. Move." They emerged beneath the palace, the air thick with the scent of incense and treachery. Above, Phordes' voice echoed, his words dripping with promises of power. Ariaramnes signaled his men to spread out, their blades drawn, their breaths held. The strike was swift. Ariaramnes burst into the chamber, his echinacea flashing in the lamplight. Phordes' guards barely had time to react before the warrior's blade found their throats. The noble himself, pale and trembling, tried to flee, but Ariaramnes was faster. He seized Phordes, pinning him against a column, his sword pressed to the traitor's neck. "Speak," he demanded, "and name your allies, or your blood will paint this hall." Phordes, broken by fear, spilled names, nobles, generals, even priests who had turned against Darius. The list was long, and each name was a wound to Ariaramnes' trust in the empire he served. By dawn, the conspirators were rounded up, their plot shattered. Ariaramnes stood before Darius, his mission complete, but his heart heavy. The king praised him, offering gold and titles, but the warrior refused. "I fight for Persia, not for reward," he said, his voice steady but cold. Yet, as he left the palace, a new message arrived, a warning of a greater threat, one that would lead Ariaramnes into the unknown, where his legend would grow and his fate would vanish into the mists of time. The air in Persepolis was thick with the scent of myrrh and betrayal, but for Ariaramnes, the warrior who had crushed the conspiracy of Phordes, there was no time to rest. The empire, though saved from treachery within, now faced a shadow from beyond its borders. A new message had arrived, carried by a rider whose horse collapsed from exhaustion at the palace gates. The words were cryptic, scrawled in haste. A warlord from the northern steppes, a Scythian chieftain named Skunkha, was amassing an army. His target was not just plunder but the heart of Persia itself. Ariaramnes, his scars still fresh from Bactria, was summoned once more. Darius' command was clear: stop Skunkha, or the empire would burn. The northern frontier was a land of endless grasslands and merciless winds, where the Achaemenid banners meant little to the nomadic tribes. Skunkha was no ordinary raider. He was a giant of a man, his face tattooed with swirling patterns, his reputation forged in blood. Tales spoke of villages razed, their inhabitants left impaled as warnings to others. He had united the Scythian tribes, a feat unheard of, and his horde now numbered in the tens of thousands. Ariaramnes knew this was no mere rebellion, it was an invasion that could shatter the empire's northern defenses. He gathered his men, now fewer than before, their faces hardened by the battles they had already endured. The march north was a descent into a different kind of hell. The Zagros Mountains gave way to plains where the horizon stretched unbroken, a deceptive calm hiding ambushes. Ariaramnes' army, 8,000 strong, moved in tight formation, their shields raised against the arrows that could come at any moment. The warrior rode at the head, his eyes scanning the grasslands for signs of the enemy. His men whispered of Skunkha's cruelty, of how he drank the blood of fallen foes to gain their strength. Ariaramnes silenced such talk with a glance. "Fear is a chain," he said. "Break it or it binds you." Their first encounter came at a river crossing, where the water ran red before the sun had fully risen. Scythian scouts, mounted on swift horses, struck without warning, their arrows piercing armor like paper. Ariaramnes' cavalry responded, charging through the shallows, their spears finding flesh. The warrior himself rode into the fray, his Achaemenid flashing as he cut down a scout whose bow was still drawn. The skirmish was brief but costly. 20 of his men lay dead, their bodies swept away by the current. Ariaramnes ordered no burial, there was no time. The enemy was close, and every moment brought Skunkha's horde nearer. Days later, they reached a burned village, its huts reduced to ash, its people gone. The air reeked of charred wood and death. Ariaramnes dismounted, his boots sinking into the blackened earth. Among the ruins he found a child's sandal, half buried, its leather singed. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His men, however, grew restless, their murmurs of vengeance growing louder. Histasps, his loyal lieutenant, urged caution. "Skunkha wants us angry," he said. "He wants us to charge blindly." Ariaramnes nodded, but his eyes burned with a fire that spoke of retribution. He would not be baited, but neither would he let this slaughter go unanswered. The warrior devised a plan to draw Skunkha out. He sent a small detachment, led by a young captain named Tiridates, to raid a Scythian supply camp. The goal was not victory but chaos, to provoke Skunkha into revealing his position. Tiridates succeeded, burning wagons and scattering horses, but the cost was steep. Only half his men returned, their faces pale with tales of Scythian riders who fought like demons, their curved blades slicing through bone. Tiridates himself bore a wound across his chest, yet he stood tall, reporting to Ariaramnes, "They're coming. 2 days, maybe less." The warrior chose his ground carefully, a narrow pass flanked by low hills, where the Scythians' numbers would mean less. He ordered his men to fortify the pass with stakes and ditches, turning it into a choke point. Archers were positioned on the hills, their bows ready to rain death. Ariaramnes walked among his men, his presence a steadying force. "We are Persia's shield," he told them. "Let them break upon us." The men gripped their spears tighter, their fear tempered by his resolve. As night fell, the distant sound of hooves grew louder, a storm approaching. The battle began at dawn, with the Scythians charging like a tide of iron and fury. Their cavalry, clad in leather and furs, thundered toward the pass, their war cries a guttural roar. Ariaramnes stood at the center, his shield raised, his spear steady. The first wave crashed against the Persian lines, and the air filled with the clash of metal and the screams of the dying. Arrows from the hills found their marks, felling horses and riders alike. Skunkha's men were relentless, but the pass held them back, their numbers choked by the narrow terrain. Ariaramnes fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness. A Scythian warrior, his face painted with ash, swung an axe at him, but Ariaramnes parried, driving his spear through the man's throat. Another charged, only to meet the warrior's shield, which cracked the man's skull. Blood soaked the earth, and bodies piled high, but Ariaramnes never wavered. His men rallied around him, their spears a wall of death. By midday, the Scythians faltered, their charge broken. Skunkha, visible in the distance atop a black stallion, raised his fist, signaling a retreat. The pass was held, but the cost was grim. Nearly 1,000 of Ariaramnes' men lay dead, their blood mingling with the enemy's. As the sun set, Ariaramnes surveyed the carnage, his chest heaving. The victory was his, but it was hollow. Scouts reported that Skunkha's horde was regrouping, their numbers still vast. Worse, a new message arrived from Persepolis, its seal unbroken. Ariaramnes read it in silence, his face unreadable. The words spoke of a traitor within his own ranks, someone close, someone trusted. The warrior burned the parchment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The battle for Persia was far from over, and the shadow of betrayal loomed larger than ever. The pass was a graveyard, strewn with the broken bodies of Persians and Scythians alike. Ariaramnes stood among the fallen, his armor dented, his hands stained with blood. The victory had bought time, but not peace. Skunkha's horde had retreated, but their fires still burned on the horizon, a promise of more bloodshed. The message from Persepolis weighed heavier than any wound. A traitor among his men, someone who had fought beside him, shared his bread, sworn his oaths. Ariaramnes' trust, already scarred by the treachery in the capital, now faced a deeper cut. He kept the knowledge to himself, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes searched every man who passed. The army marched on, tracking Skunkha's forces across the steppe. The terrain grew harsher, the grass giving way to rocky outcrops and shallow rivers. Supplies were scarce, and the men grew lean, their rations barely enough to sustain them. Ariaramnes drove them forward, his will a fire that burned brighter than their hunger. He knew Skunkha would not wait long. The Scythian was cunning, striking only when the odds favored him. The warrior sent scouts to track the enemy's movements, but many did not return. Those who did spoke of traps, pits lined with spikes, hidden beneath the grass, claiming men and horses alike. One night, as the army camped by a shallow stream, a scout stumbled into the firelight, his face pale, an arrow protruding from his shoulder. "Skunkha's camp," he gasped, 10 miles north, near the ruins of an old fort. Ariaramnes knelt beside him, his hand steady as he broke the arrow's shaft. The scout's words confirmed what he had feared. Skunkha was preparing for a final stand, his horde fortified in a crumbling stronghold. The warrior knew a siege would be costly, but waiting would only strengthen the enemy. He called his officers, Hystasps, Tiridates, and a grizzled veteran named Otanes, to plan the assault. The fort was a relic of a forgotten tribe, its walls cracked but thick, its gates reinforced with iron. Skunkha had turned it into a death trap, with archers on the ramparts and cavalry ready to flank any attackers. Ariaramnes studied the terrain from a nearby ridge, his mind mapping every angle. A frontal assault would be suicide, and a siege would take weeks they did not have. Instead, he devised a plan born of desperation and cunning. He would use the darkness, the one ally the Scythians could not outrun. Under the cover of a moonless night, Ariaramnes led a small force of 500 men, the best of his immortals, to the fort's western wall. They carried no torches, their armor wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. The warrior had ordered a diversion, a feigned attack on the eastern gate, led by Hystasps, to draw Skunkha's attention. As the shouts and clash of steel echoed from the east, Ariaramnes' men scaled the walls, their hands gripping crumbling stone. One man slipped, his body crashing to the ground with a sickening crunch. Ariaramnes did not pause. There was no room for mercy in this moment. They reached the ramparts undetected, their blades gleaming faintly in the starlight. The Scythian sentries, focused on the diversion, never saw the shadows that cut their throats. Ariaramnes moved like a specter, his echinacea silent but deadly. His men fanned out, disabling the gate's mechanisms, allowing the main force to pour in. The fort erupted into chaos as the Persians struck from within, their spears and swords tearing through the unprepared defenders. Skunkha's men, caught sleeping or distracted, fell in droves, their blood pooling on the ancient stones. The chieftain himself was found in the fort's central hall, his axe raised, his eyes wild with rage. Ariaramnes faced him alone, the two warriors circling like predators. Skunkha was taller, broader, his strength legendary, but Ariaramnes was faster, his movements precise. The Scythian swung, his axe cleaving the air, but Ariaramnes dodged, his echinacea slashing Skunkha's arm. Blood sprayed, and the chieftain roared, charging with the force of a bull. Ariaramnes met him head-on, his shield absorbing the blow, his sword finding the gap in Skunkha's armor. The chieftain fell, his lifeblood staining the floor, his eyes still burning with defiance. The fort was taken, but the victory was marred. As Ariaramnes rallied his men, a cry rang out. A Persian soldier, one of his own, was found with a Scythian dagger, poised to strike Hystasps from behind. The traitor was seized, his face revealed as Otanes, the veteran Ariaramnes had trusted for years. The warrior's heart sank, but his hand did not falter. He drove his echinacea through Otanes' chest, his voice cold, "You chose your fate." The men watched in silence, their trust in each other shaken. Ariaramnes burned the fort to the ground, leaving no trace of the battle, and turned south. The march back to Persepolis was silent, the weight of betrayal heavier than any wound. Ariaramnes carried the burden alone, his thoughts dark. A final message awaited him, its seal unbroken, its words hinting at a new mission, one that would lead him beyond the empire's borders, into a land where his name would become legend, and his fate would vanish into the unknown. The weight of betrayal clung to Ariaramnes like a second skin as he led his men south from the smoldering ruins of the Scythian fort. The death of Otanes, a man he had called brother, had left a wound no blade could match. The warriors' army, now barely 6,000 strong, marched in silence, their trust fractured, their bodies worn by endless battles. The steppe winds carried the scent of dust and blood, a reminder of the cost of their victories. Yet, the final message from Persepolis burned in Ariaramnes' mind, its words a summons to a mission unlike any before, a journey beyond the empire's borders, into the shadowed lands of the Indus, where a new threat stirred. Darius' spies had uncovered whispers of a coalition forming in the east, led by a warrior priest named Kshatrida, who claimed divine favor from the gods of the industry. He was no mere warlord. His followers believed him a prophet, his words igniting rebellion among the satrapies of Gandhara and beyond. Kshatrida's army was small but fervent, their zeal matched only by their brutality. Villages that refused to join him were burned, their people sacrificed on altars to unknown deities. Darius could not spare his main army, stretched thin across the empire, so the task fell to Ariaramnes: end the rebellion before it spread, or the eastern frontier would collapse. The journey to the Indus was a trial of endurance. The army crossed deserts where the sun blistered their skin and rivers swollen with monsoon rains. Ariaramnes led with grim determination, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his thoughts guarded. Hystasps, his last trusted lieutenant, rode beside him, but even their bond was strained by the specter of Otane's betrayal. The men whispered of curses, of gods angered by the blood they had spilled. Ariaramnes silenced them with a single command: the gods care not for our fears. We fight for the living. His words steadied them, but the shadow of doubt lingered. Their first encounter with Kshatrida's forces came in a jungle clearing, where the air was thick with humidity and the buzz of insects. The enemy struck at dusk, their warriors painted with ash and ochre, their spears tipped with bone. The attack was chaos, screams pierced the twilight as arrows flew from the trees. Ariaramnes rallied his men, forming a shield wall that held against the onslaught. He fought at the forefront, his echinacea a blur, cutting through flesh and bone. A warrior with a serpent tattoo lunged at him, but Ariaramnes drove his spear through the man's chest, pinning him to the earth. The skirmish ended with the enemy retreating into the jungle, leaving behind a trail of blood and broken idols. The victory was fleeting. Scouts reported that Kshatrida's main force was encamped in a fortified valley, its cliffs adorned with carvings of gods with many arms. The warrior priest had gathered thousands, their numbers bolstered by defectors from Persian garrisons. Ariaramnes knew a direct assault would be costly, but time was against him. The monsoon rains would soon flood the valley, trapping his army in mud and disease. He devised a plan to strike at the heart of the rebellion. Capture Kshatrida himself, and his followers would scatter. Under the cover of a storm, Ariaramnes led a small force of 300 men through the jungle, their path lit only by lightning. The rain masked their movements, but it turned the ground to sludge, slowing their advance. One man triggered a hidden trap, a net of vines that yanked him into the trees, his screams cut short by a spear. Ariaramnes pressed on, his men following in grim silence. They reached the valley's edge at midnight, the enemy camp glowing faintly through the downpour. Kshatrida's tent, adorned with crimson banners, stood at the center, guarded by warriors whose eyes gleamed with fanatic zeal. The attack was swift and brutal. Ariaramnes' men struck from the shadows, their blades silent but deadly. The guards fell without a sound, their blood washed away by the rain. Ariaramnes entered the tent alone, his echinacea drawn, his shield raised. Kshatrida stood waiting, his robes soaked, a curved dagger in his hand. The warrior priest's eyes burned with a strange light, his voice calm but venomous. "You cannot kill a god's chosen." Ariaramnes answered with steel, his sword meeting Kshatrida's dagger in a clash that echoed through the tent. The fight was brief but savage. Kshatrida's skill was no match for Ariaramnes' strength. The warrior drove his blade through the priest's heart, ending the rebellion with a single stroke. The valley fell into chaos as Kshatrida's followers fled, their faith shattered. Ariaramnes ordered the camp burned, its idols toppled into the mud. His men, exhausted but victorious, looked to him for guidance, but the warrior's gaze was distant. The message from Persepolis had hinted at a final task, one that would take him beyond the Indus, into lands unknown even to the empire's maps. As they prepared to march, a scout arrived, his face pale, his words trembling. A new force was gathering, not of men, but of shadows, tales of a cult that worshipped death itself, led by a figure known only as the Veiled One. Ariaramnes burned the scout's report, his decision made. He would face this final threat alone, sparing his men further bloodshed. He entrusted Hystasps with command, ordering him to return to Persepolis with the army. His lieutenant protested, but Ariaramnes' voice was iron. "Persia needs you alive. My path lies elsewhere." Under the cover of night, he slipped away, his horse carrying him into the eastern mists, toward a fate no man could foresee. Ariaramnes rode alone into the unknown, the jungle giving way to a land of jagged cliffs and silent rivers. The tales of the Veiled One had haunted the edges of his mind since the scout's report, a figure cloaked in black, leading a cult that revered death as a god. They were no army, but a plague, striking villages and leaving only bones behind. The warrior's mission was clear: find the Veiled One and end their terror, or the empire's eastern frontier would become a graveyard. His horse, weary but loyal, carried him through paths unmarked by man, where the air grew heavy with an unnatural stillness. The first sign of the cult came at a ruined temple, its stones blackened by fire, its altars stained with blood. Ariaramnes dismounted, his echinacea at his side, his senses sharp. Carvings on the walls depicted a figure shrouded in darkness, surrounded by skulls. The warrior's breath caught as he heard a faint chant, rising from the earth itself. He followed the sound, descending into a network of caves beneath the temple. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, lit only by the faint glow of his torch. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, but Ariaramnes pressed on, his heart steady despite the dread that clawed at him. The caves opened into a vast chamber, where the cult gathered around a stone altar. Robed figures swayed, their chants a low, guttural hum. At the center stood the Veiled One, their face hidden, their hands holding a dagger that gleamed with an eerie light. Ariaramnes counted dozens of followers, their eyes vacant, their bodies marked with scars. He knew a fight here would be his last, but retreat was not in his blood. He stepped into the light, his voice cutting through the chant. "Your God is a lie. Face me, or die in shame." The Veiled One turned, their movements fluid, almost inhuman. The cultists parted, their chants falling silent. The figures spoke, their voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere. "You cannot slay what is eternal." Ariaramnes charged, his echinacea aimed at the Veiled One's heart. The figure moved faster than he expected, their dagger parrying his strike with a force that shook his arm. The cultists surged forward, their blades drawn, but Ariaramnes fought like a storm, his spear and sword carving through flesh. Blood sprayed across the stone, and the chamber echoed with screams. The Veiled One was no ordinary foe. Their movements were precise, their strength unnatural. Ariaramnes' shield shattered under a blow from their dagger, and a slash opened a gash across his chest. Pain seared through him, but he fought on, his will unbroken. He drove his echinacea into the Veiled One's shoulder, drawing a hiss of pain. The figure staggered, their veil slipping to reveal a face scarred beyond recognition, eyes burning with hatred. Ariaramnes seized the moment, his spear piercing the Veiled One's chest. The figure fell, their dagger clattering to the ground, their cultists frozen in shock. The chamber was a slaughterhouse, the cult broken, their leader dead. Ariaramnes stood panting, his body bleeding, his strength fading. He burned the altar, the flames consuming the carvings and the bodies. As he stumbled from the cave, the dawn broke, its light harsh against his wounds. He knew he could not return to Persepolis, not yet. The empire was safe, but his path was unfinished. Tales of his deeds would reach Darius, carried by merchants and travelers, but Ariaramnes himself would not. He mounted his horse, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where mountains rose like the edge of the world. Centuries passed, and the name Ariaramnes faded into myth. In Persepolis, scribes recorded his victories, but none could say where he went. Some claimed he wandered into the lands of the Indus, seeking new battles. Others whispered he found peace in a distant valley, his scars hidden beneath a farmer's cloak. The truth was lost, like footprints in the sand. Yet, in the villages of Persia, old men still spoke of the warrior who defended the empire, who faced betrayal and death without flinching, and who vanished into the mists of time, his legend enduring where his name did not. His story, etched in blood and fire, became a whisper on the wind, a tale of a man who was Persia's shield, unbroken to the last.